Turn to chapter 11 of the book of John. Chapters 2 through 12 are sometimes called the book of signs because in chapters 2 to 12, Jesus performs a number of miracles that in the book of John are referred to as signs. That may not communicate to us in English, but it certainly did in Greek and it certainly did in Hebrew. A sign is a prearranged event from God that involves and indicates His presence in a particular moment or action. Often those signs, those miraculous things that happen were validating a messenger, whether it was a prophet in the Old Testament or Jesus. So there have been 7 signs, and today we're talking about the 7th sign, and Ben's going to follow up next week also talking about what happened after Jesus performed this incredible sign, which involves someone coming back from death. Of course, we know the story of Jesus, and the gospel itself is the story of Jesus coming back from death. And Jesus brings back Lazarus as almost a precursor to the incredible sign of His own resurrection as well. I think all of us know that for humans, life is the ultimate mystery, but death is the ultimate concern. We don't really even know how to deal with death. Jesus in the Gospels deals with it a few times. There are actually three moments when Jesus raises someone, brings them back from death. But the one we're going to see in John chapter 11 is different than all the others, both in detail and depth. He spends more time talking about the event and what happened, but they're also different, or it's also different because of the scope of the event. It was more public than those other events were. The fallout of this, of course, is that people begin to notice Jesus in a new way. There's even more hubbub. There's more talk about Him. In some cases, there's more furor over Jesus who would do such a thing. But even more than that, we'll see later on in the chapter, in chapter 12, that even some Greeks begin asking questions and expressing faith in the person of Jesus. So you almost see a crescendoing of the miraculous things that Jesus does, finding the fullest expression in the raising of Lazarus from the dead, so that people begin responding in new ways. And why would that be? Because death is the great mystery. Because death is the great concern. We don't always know how to deal with it. Of course, Christians offer a message that doesn't run away from death and is not elusive when it comes to talking about the issue of death, but instead talks about it head on. And Jesus put it right in the core of the message when He Himself raised from death and said that you can walk in the newness of life and in resurrected life yourself as those who are followers of Christ. It is the core of the message. So we live in a world where people are running from death and trying to make it look better with flowers and ceremony, doing the best we can to ignore it and not talk about it, or just not knowing how to deal with it at all. In fact, one of the things I noticed, I served a lot of the second half of my pastoral ministry as a chaplain in contexts, as a police chaplain, as a hospital chaplain, and as a prison chaplain. Chaplains largely deal with death. In all 3 of those contexts, a chaplain is called when somebody dies. So most of the time when I'm called to show up somewhere, when a chaplain is called to show up, it's because someone has died. When I was a police chaplain, which was my first stint, and it was here in Shawnee, I was a chaplain with the Shawnee Police Department. One of the things I noticed over the time that I served as a police chaplain was that funerals are not something that a lot of people want. I would show up because someone has died suddenly and spend time with the family. They were often waiting for a coroner, so I'd be there for upwards of 3 and 4 hours. Usually trying to spot the policeman who didn't really want to be there and hang with the family. It was very awkward for them in some cases, and so I would show up and do that. And gladly so. And I'd talk to them about arrangements and ask if there's anything I could do to help if they didn't have a church home. And many times they didn't have a church home. I found that of those who did not have a church home or didn't have any church involvement, they would often say just up front, there's not going to be a funeral, we won't be doing anything like that. And you know, when I was younger, that was seldom the case. Even in secular culture, people would have some kind of a service, and I think we're struggling with the ability of knowing what to do with the issue of death and facing it and looking directly at it. It's hard for us. I've developed a list of what I call contemporary spiritual alternatives, CSAs. They're sort of a response of the current generation to wanting to have a spirituality but not wanting to connect with any kind of denomination or with any kind of specific religious movement. And so these CSAs are spiritual alternatives. In fact, many of the polls that you've heard people talk about where people are nunners, they say that they have no association with a religious denomination or movement. They might claim some of these kinds of spiritualities, and there's a number of them, and I don't want to talk about all of them, but one of them is something that's called transhumanism. Does that sound weird? Transhumanism is the idea of current generations that they believe technology will eventually take us to the place where your consciousness and your thoughts and your ideas can be downloaded into technology, and you can find eternal life in some kind of technological apparatus with your essence downloaded. You know, the likelihood of that happening is so wild in my mind, it just staggers the imagination. But what is interesting to me is that this idea of transhumanism is catching like such wildfire. I think people don't know how to respond to death. I think it staggers us. And that's why it is the ultimate concern for us, because we don't know what to do with it. So the chaplain shows up at 2 a.m, because that's the only time anything ever happens, and has to tell a family member that their father was found, he'd hung himself, or that your son has died on the highway. Just over and over and over. So you see everything. I remember I went to one house, and for some reason I remember this man because it seemed to me he was the least equipped to handle the issue of death. And I told him, and we were taught how to do it. You just, it's like a Band-Aid right off, right? They know you're there, you're standing with a sergeant, something's going on. And so you just come out with it. Sir, I'm sorry to tell you, but your son was killed in an automobile accident about an hour and 20 minutes ago. And at that particular moment, I was just shocked. I'm there for the sergeant because he doesn't want to have to deal with a personal thing. The man had opened the door like this. It was like 2 a.m. And I told him that his son had been killed in an automobile accident. He said, "Okay, is there anything else?" I said, "Is there any way I can help? Anything I can do?" "No, thank you." "Is there anything else?" "No." "Okay." Just shut the door. Well, there's a story there. There was something there. And if there's no story, there's the individual's inability to face death. And more often than not, I saw people just drop to the ground. Drop to the ground. I remember a lady, no one was there to catch her, and she just dropped to the ground. The most horrifying moment was when I had to tell a family that the father was found and he'd hung himself in his apartment. There had been a divorce involved. A 10-year-old boy came up to me and started beating on me physically. He didn't even know who I was. We don't know what to do with death. Here's what's really crazy about this story, about John 11. The death of Lazarus, Jesus' friend, gives us an unexpected and an unusual image. Jesus in grief. Jesus crying. You know the verse, everybody memorizes that one because it's 2 verses, right? Jesus wept. 2 verses in Greek, 2 words in Greek too. But we memorize it and we get used to it and we don't think about it. Well, it seems kind of unexpected that Jesus would cry. The God-man, God in the flesh, one with his Father, performing perfectly every work the Father gave him, knowing the beginning from the end. It shocks us just a little bit. Now, because of this, more people are coming to faith, and miracles that Jesus are doing, especially like this one, are convincing many people to follow. And so the movement seems to be getting steam. Obviously, it's crescendoed now to where people are ready to accept Jesus at some level as Messiah. But in the middle of all this, Jesus is grieved. And maybe not because of the reason we think. Well, let's jump in. There's a lot of passage today, and there's a lot of passage next week too, because John gives a place of prominence to this event, to this 7th sign. I think because of its impact, but I also think because of the way it prefigures the fact that Jesus would also raise from the dead. And this is a bit of a shift in the book. From Jesus' public ministry in these 7 signs, there's going to be a shifting after we get to chapter 12, where Jesus now focuses in on his 12, his guys, the ones he's training, who aren't mentioned in a list, which is unusual in Mark. In the other Gospels, there's a list given of their names, and you don't have that in John, but you do have this section where he pulls them aside before he's crucified, and he invests in them, and we'll get there in a little bit. But first, Jesus is demonstrating his own person to the public one more time. So we see these vignettes. Let's just read verses 1 through 16. Try to make it through pretty quickly. And we see the disciples on the road to the sign that's about to be performed. Now a man was sick, Lazarus from Bethany, the village of Mary and his sister Martha. Isn't it interesting how John assumes everybody knows about Mary and Martha? They had some renown in the early church, probably because they were personal friends of Jesus. The text tells us, in maybe an unexpected way, that he seems to have uniquely loved the trio, the 2 sisters and Lazarus. Well, anyway, verse 2. Mary was the one who anointed the Lord with perfume and wiped his feet with her hair, and it was her brother Lazarus who was sick. So the sisters sent a message to him, Lord, the one you love is sick. And they seem to expect that Jesus will know who that is. There's a unique relationship there. I don't know about you. I don't even think about that much. You know, he wasn't one of the 12. So someone who was outside that happy band could be described as someone that Jesus uniquely loved. We just don't think of Jesus and his humanity like that. You know how we, as humans, click with certain people and we have special relationships, and it seems Jesus had the same. Not that he didn't love others, or that he couldn't, but there was something unique going on here. Verse 4, when Jesus heard it, he almost casually says, this sickness will not end in death, but it's for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Jesus refers to himself again as the Son of God. He seems he's doing that more often now, almost as though he's aware of the need to fulfill John's purpose statement in chapter 20. These things are written so that you may believe that he is the Messiah, the Son of God. Now, Jesus loved Martha, her sister, and Lazarus. So when he heard that he was sick. Now get that, verse 6. Rightly translated in the CSB, by the way. So, therefore, when he heard that he was sick, he stayed 2 more days in the place where he was. Then after that, he said to the disciples, okay, let's go to Judea again. Now they had left Judea. Do you remember why in chapter 10? Remember the healing of the blind man and all the dust that kicked up with the religious leaders? And in fact, because of the things that Jesus said when he began teaching about who he was, because they said, who are you? And so he says, well, I'm the great shepherd, and let me tell you what that means. And then they picked up stones to stone him. They were ready to execute Jesus on the charge of blasphemy. So they hightail it. And the text tells us in chapter 10 that they went to a place probably called Betania, some miles away, Transjordan, just to be away from there. And after 2 days, Jesus said, let's go to Judea again. Rabbi, the disciples told him, just now the Jews tried to stone you, and you're going there again? Really? You want to go back to Jerusalem? The place where they attempted to take you out, by the way, not one, but multiple times? Why would you do that? Jesus says, aren't there 12 hours in a day? Well, in the Jewish mindset, in the Roman mindset, there was. They divided the day up into 12 daylight and 12 nighttime hours. They were kind of a bicameral way of viewing the day. And Jesus says there are 12 days or hours in a day, so if anyone walks during the day, he doesn't stumble because he sees the light of this world, which was Jesus' metaphor for himself. But if anyone walks during the night, he does stumble because the light is not in him. Jesus is saying, guys, we have a limited amount of time to work. I'm here with you now. We're going to keep moving. Okay. He said this, and then he told them, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I'm on my way to wake him up. From the third person to the singular person, to the first person, right? He's our friend, but I'm going to wake him up. Well, the disciples said, Lord, you know what? If he's fallen asleep, then he'll get well. You know, sickness makes people tired. I get a sinus infection, I sleep for a day and a half. That's what happens when you get sick. They're going, well, if he's sick, don't worry about it. He'll wake up. But Jesus was speaking about his death. They thought he was speaking about natural sleep, verse 14. So Jesus then told them plainly, Lazarus has died. I'm glad for you that I wasn't there, so that you may believe. Let's go to him. Then Thomas, called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, let's go too, so that we may die with him. Now, what I want to see in all of this, and there's a lot to see here, more than we've already seen, I want to look at the things going on with the disciples. Because what I see in them is sort of a faltering or maybe even a hesitant faith. And this is a part of what Jesus is surrounded by in this moment where his friend Lazarus dies. The three comments of the guys. First of all, really, you want to go back to Judea? I mean, and in that we see that they are fearful. There was the healing of the blind man, the Good Shepherd sermon. All of this led to an attempt to kill Jesus. Why would we return? It's almost as if the disciples could anticipate the disposition of millions of disciples who would come after them, who wonder if it's really the place of the followers of Jesus to take risks. Right? Shouldn't my situation be getting better and better now that I'm a Christ follower? And Jesus is saying, guys, let's go to Jerusalem. Now, you know what they're thinking because of what Thomas says later. Well, if he's going to die, let's go die with him. They understood what it meant to go back to Jerusalem. And their response is, but Jesus, probably we shouldn't take that kind of a risk because after all, somebody could get hurt. I know there's a tension. There is a tension of looking out for my own safety and that of my family and the realization that sometimes God asks us to do things that puts us in harm's way and may yield a cost, may yield on our part a sacrifice. You know what? If you want to look at the end of the life of all the apostles as best we know them, it wasn't a pretty story at the end. They ended up walking headlong into risk all of their lives, and as best we know, all of them died for it and in it. And Jesus sometimes asks that. It's not always going to get better. I don't care what televangelist you're listening to. It's not necessarily true that Jesus wants you to be comfortable and to have everything that you ever wanted. That is not true. He may have that for you, but that's up to him. That's why he's, let's see, what's the word I want? Sovereign. And I'm not. It's not for me to choose. It is for me to follow and to obey. The disciples were going to live lives of almost incalculable risk until the day that they died. But here they don't get it. And I think it's the trajectory of the Christian life to become increasingly aware that sometimes the Master leads me into dark corners, and that's okay. Sometimes he asks me to do something that might put me at risk, and that's okay. And I will follow him there. Their first statement was one of fear. Really, should we go back? I don't think it's a good idea. Secondly, they said, well, if he's asleep, then he'll wake up. So they were fearful. Secondly, they were confused. Now, in Greek myth, sleep and death were seen as twin brothers. But the metaphor wasn't quite as common either in the Old Testament or in Second Temple Judaism, which is the time when Jesus is talking to his disciples, as it will become later on in New Testament theology. You're familiar with the fact in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 that death is described as sleeping, right? We sleep in Christ. Paul, writing to the Thessalonians, talk about those who are asleep in Christ. Stephen was said to go to sleep. There's some Old Testament references where those patriarchs would sleep with their fathers, but it wasn't such an accessible metaphor that those who were listening said to themselves, oh, he's talking about death. Now, it may have been subconscious that they were going, I don't want to go back to Judea, so Lazarus will be okay. I don't know what was going on. But the point is, John is picking up an old theme that you see in all of the Gospels, and especially in John and Mark, that the disciples are often confused at the things that Jesus says. It's the nature of a disciple to be confused. But more than that, they're also reckless. In verse 16, Thomas makes an interesting comment. By the way, Thomas gets kind of a bad rap. He's only mentioned a few times in the Gospels. We don't know a lot about him, but because of his moment of doubt after the resurrection of Jesus, he's pegged as the lifelong doubter. But here he's painted in a rather different light. Here he's cogitating, probably very quickly, not thinking very long through it. I'm guessing this is a fairly quick conversation. And Jesus says, guys, buck up. We're going to Jerusalem. And by the way, this is going to be the triumphal entry. This is when everything gets crazy, right? He says, we are going to Jerusalem. And so Thomas's wheels start turning, and he speaks on behalf of everybody in a bold but perhaps reckless and not really particularly informed moment. He says, you know what, if he's going to die, then let's all die with him too. And you see, they don't really understand why Jesus is going to die. He had been telling them in some degree and in some detail, but they didn't understand that he was going for a redemptive purpose, to die for the sins of those who will come to him. It was stated at his birth that that was his purpose, and Jesus was clear about it on a number of occasions, but it's not quite sinking in to the disciples. So Thomas does the best he can with the moment, and he says, okay then, if we're going to Jerusalem, let's all die together. The disciples, they're an interesting lot, probably a lot like us. They were fearful. They were not risk takers, just like a church. They were confused often, and they were just reckless in their thinking. And Jesus used them in a great way. Well, now as we arrive, see things happening, we meet some other people in verse 17. When Jesus arrived, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Bethany was near Jerusalem, less than 2 miles away. But remember, he waited to go for 2 days on purpose. He said he was doing it on purpose. Many of the Jews had come to Martha and to Mary to comfort them about their brother. As soon as Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went to meet him, but Mary remained seated in the house. Then Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, then my brother wouldn't have died. Yet even now I know that whatever you ask from God, he will give you. It's unclear what Martha thinks there. It doesn't seem that she thinks that he can raise Lazarus from the dead, because she opposes Jesus later from opening the tomb, because after all it stinks and don't go there. Right? So it's unclear what the degree to which her faith extends at this moment. But there's a clear statement of faith. So Jesus says, you know what? Your brother will rise again. Well, she's a good Jewess. So she said, I know that he'll rise again in the resurrection at the last day, Daniel chapter 12. She knew that there was a resurrection of the righteous, that she believed that her brother would be among that band. That Jesus said to her, look, I'm the resurrection and the life, and the one who believes in me now, even if he dies, will live. Second, he says, everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? He tests her. Now look what she says, verse 27. Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who comes into the world. It's interesting, her statement there, and the shift of John in this part of the book, because John says that in chapter 20 and verse 30 that his purpose in writing all the miracles that Jesus did, and he says there are other miracles that aren't even included in this book, but he said these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. And her confession here is, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, almost as if John is telling us that the miracles we're having their intended effect. At least in the case of some. Well, we're going to meet Mary in just a moment, but let's talk a little bit about Martha. And it's interesting, too, these descriptions of Mary and Martha, because they come from Luke's gospel, particularly in chapter 10. We have a number of references of both of them. But the descriptions of them and their character is similar in Luke's gospel as they are here, and this overlap in description seems to be casual. In other words, the description of their personalities and the way they behave in this narrative is not crucial to the story. It's not a part of the actual story. They're mentioned just sort of as descriptive happenstance. Scholars have taken note of this, and they call it a number of different things. D.A. Carson refers to them as interlocking traditions. Peter Williams refers to them as narrative coincidences, saying that they just give the flavor of reliable accounts of Gospels that were written by different people who record essentially the same things in different ways and from different perspectives. All of that aside, John assumes that the sisters are known by their readers. Martha is the first one that we meet, and she says this, if you had been here, she says, my brother would not have died. Now, she may not have known that Jesus waited on purpose for 2 days. I'm wondering if that reached her ears. There's probably one bonehead disciple who would tell her, well, Jesus said we were going to wait. There's always one of those guys. But I don't know that. I don't know if she knew that, but Jesus did wait, verse 6. You know, it's interesting. Later rabbinic sources suggested that a spirit of a dead person hovered over the body for 3 days. And then on the fourth day, when it saw what was happening to the body, decomposition, the spirit said, well, I guess this game is over, and would leave. So the magic number was the fourth day. Now that is a later tradition. It comes sometime after Jesus. It's not really clear exactly how much after Jesus. But those traditions that were written reflect oral tradition that predated them, and so this may have been a prevailing attitude that was there nonetheless. That might have been what was going on. If so, Jesus was playing into it, saying, let's give it a little bit of time, because I'm going to work the impossible, the absolutely impossible, when Lazarus comes forth. It's a very real possibility. It's interesting that Jesus' actions seemed to contradict his love for Lazarus. It's just such a weird statement when it tells us that he loved Lazarus so much. So, when he heard that he was sick, he stayed for 2 more days. And Mary and Martha seem to give a head nod that Jesus could have done something about the sickness. It's not clear that their faith extends to the ability of resurrecting somebody. I don't know what they knew of what Jesus had done before, because those previous resurrections were kind of private affairs. It's hard to say what they knew, but at any rate, it seems that Jesus' actions contradict his claim to love Lazarus in very, very unique ways. His care does not always work as we would expect, but he asks that we would trust him. You know? Sometimes he takes us through pain instead of going around it. It might be that Martha here is the first to engage, at least from Christological times, the what-if argument, or if only. If only God had chosen this, or if only he would have done that. And that doesn't serve our pain very well, does it? You know? You know how it shows up in other ways? It's the why question. Someone passes, and it wasn't expected, and it's tragic, and it's horrible loss, and so we ask why. It's a very lot like the what-if thing, and it's counterproductive. It's counterproductive. Do you know why it's counterproductive? We could talk about this all day, but probably the most obvious reason it's counterproductive is he's not going to tell you. Sorry. He's not going to tell you. God doesn't do faxes. You can ask why? And what God is wanting you to ask is, what, Lord, do you want me to do now? I'm going to trust you in this moment. Let's see how this plays out. I think there's more here. By the way, her response to Jesus, yes, I know he'll rise on the last day, was orthodox, but it missed what Jesus was saying. And Jesus expands on it when he says, look, you need to understand, I am the resurrection and the life now, and the one who believes in me now, even if he dies, will live. So I'm the resurrection. If he dies, he will live. And then he says, I am the life. A different claim. I'm the life, and whoever lives will never die. He says similar things in different ways, saying you need to understand in another series of I am statements that Jesus gives that expand on the fact that he's the Messiah and that he's divine in nature. He says, I'm the resurrection, you don't need to fear death. I am the life, in me you have eternal life right now. The one who lives now, not the one who is living will never die, but the one who lives in me will never die, has unique and eternal life. Well, Mary shows up, verse 28. Having said this, she went back and called her sister Mary. And this is just like this, like the other picture where Martha's out busy doing all the stuff in the house and Mary's sitting at the feet of Jesus. You have one who's the worker, the task-oriented accomplisher, maybe. And then you have Mary who's more contemplative and more in the moment and there with Jesus. And you see the same thing here. So in this case, she went back and called her sister Mary, saying in private, and I don't know why in private, the teacher is here, and he's calling for you. Maybe she didn't want certain listeners to hear because things were always stirring up, and maybe they're aware of that. I don't know. Verse 29, as soon as Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Jesus had not yet come into the village, but was still in the place where Martha had met him. The Jews who were with her in the house, consoling her, saw that Mary got up quickly and went out. They followed her, supposing that she was going to the tomb to cry there. But as Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet. By the way, every time you see Mary, there's only 3 of them. She's always at Jesus' feet. Every time. She was a worshiper. And she told him, Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. Now, a lot is made of the fact that they say the exact same thing. And it seems like the sisters were rehearsing what was going on. And they probably were. They had the same outlook. If only the Lord would be here. If only the Lord were here. And they were so prepped that when Jesus arrives, they say the exact same thing. Well, not exactly. And I don't want to make too much out of it, but there's a marginal, slight difference in the word order in the Greek from what Martha says and what Mary says. What Martha says here is, Jesus, if you had been here, then my brother wouldn't have died. But what Mary says is, my brother, if you had been here, he would not have died. The possessive pronoun that goes with brother, my brother, is in the emphatic position because of its placement in the statement of Mary. I don't want to make too much of it, but I wonder if they were thinking a little bit differently. I look at this and I sort of wonder if Martha was just talking about the tragedy of the death itself. And if Jesus had been here, then this tragedy wouldn't have happened. Maybe he wouldn't have died so young. Mary is asking the question, why did it have to be my brother? And doesn't this look like the two faces of the why question that we ask? You always have a tendency to want to ask, why did this happen now? He was only 20 years old. The other why question is, why did this have to happen to him? He was so special to me. It's almost as if they're working out their grief in two different ways. And the fact is, Jesus' answer to their grief and the way it plays out, as similar as these responses are to our own responses to loss today, why now and why him or why her, Jesus' response is the same for everybody. But actually where we're going is the surprise part to me. I know it's a lot. I'm sorry. Let's read verse 33. When Jesus saw her crying, and the Jews who had come with her crying, he was deeply moved in his spirit. That's an interesting word. Troubled is even more interesting. It actually means to snort, and usually refers to someone who is upset over a moment or something that's happening. He was troubled and moved in his spirit. Where have you put him? He asks. Lord, they told him, come and see. And Jesus wept. So the Jews said, oh, see how much he loved him. But some of them said, well, couldn't he who opened the blind man's eyes also have kept this man from dying? More confusion over Jesus. What do we make out of this and what's going on? Then Jesus, deeply moved again, came to the tomb. It was a cave and a stone was lying against it. Remove the stone, Jesus said. I don't know. Maybe it's just me, but something hits me about the terse way Jesus approaches this. Where is he? Move the stone. Jesus is snorting in his spirit. He's troubled by something that he sees. This is not the description of someone who's just dealing with personal loss and grief. There's more going on. Martha, the dead man's sister, said, Lord, there's already a stench because he's been dead for 4 days. Jesus could have said, yeah, I know, I held off a little. But he didn't. Jesus said to her, didn't I tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? So they removed the stone. Then Jesus raised his eyes and said, Father, I thank you that you heard me. I know that you always hear me, but because of the crowd standing here, I said this so that they would believe you sent me. There's the phrase again. The phrase that got Jesus in trouble was his claim that he was sent from the Father. His unique relationship to the Father was the sticking point between him and the religious leaders of the day, and he calls to it again, now calling on the evidence of God's support of him in this final an amazing seventh sign. After he said this, he shouted with a loud voice, Lazarus, come out! The dead man came out, bound hand and foot with linen strips, and with his face wrapped in a cloth. And Jesus said to them, unwrap him and let him go. Therefore, many of the Jews who came to Mary and saw what he did believed in him, but some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. When Jesus saw her crying and saw the Jews who'd come with her crying, then he was deeply moved in his spirit. He already knew Lazarus was dead. He'd already faced the loss. What was going on? Well, there's a couple of ways that people look at this. His grief could have been either empathetic hurting, right? That would be us. That's the mother that falls on the ground, or the husband that picks her up. It's the empathetic hurting. Or it could be a sense of personal loss. But Jesus is the one who said his death would not result in death, basically is what he said. What is a sense of personal loss? That's not what was going on here. Jesus came to help them work through that. So what was going on? What I think is going on is that there's a grief of spirit over the lack of faith of those who are all around him. In fact, if you look at verse 28, it says he was moved again after they say what? Couldn't he who opened the blind man's eyes also have kept this man from dying? They had some faith in Jesus the Messiah, but not any kind of faith that took them beyond the great concern of all humanity, death. Not that far. Jesus was going to bump up their game. In this moment, Jesus was saying, guys, it's more than you think. My lordship goes further than you think here. I think that Jesus was grieved by the faltering, divided, and confused faith in a world that he had come to save and to offer hope. You see, the fact is that security in Christ should yield security in living. But it doesn't always, does it? I mean, we're a lot like Martha. Yes, Lord, I believe that you're the Messiah, you're the Son of God, but don't open the tomb. He stinks and you can't do anything about that. That's us, isn't it? We're very much like that. But the fact is, security in Christ should yield security in living. It should prepare the soul for the ultimate reality, translation to the presence with the Lord. I had a Lutheran pastor tell me years ago his problem with what he called evangelicals. It was a shot at me, by the way. I was a Baptist. He said, the problem I see with you evangelicals is that you spend all of your time preparing people to know how to live next week, but you don't prepare anybody to die. I never forgot that. That was decades ago. And I thought, you know what? He's right. We give sermons on, how to find more time in your day, how to live with a good attitude, how to be happy and whistle a song when your boss hates you. We're always talking about tomorrow and what I'm doing today. And Jesus asked the question, Martha, what exactly do you believe? Where exactly are you on this? The most concerning question that you have, the loss of your brother. Christians, we've got to take it there. I just love what Paul said because Paul brings clarity. Paul, when he wrote the Thessalonians, says, look, I don't want you to sorrow. No, he said more than that. When you're facing the loss of a loved one, he didn't say, I just don't want you to feel any sorrow, because that would be plastic and phony. We don't want people to be plastic and phony when their loved one dies, not to feel anything and say, well, it's okay because I know where they are, and you don't feel any sense of loss. That's not real. But what Paul said was, we should not sorrow, here it is, as those with no hope. There are two kinds of grief. They're both grief, and they're both powerful, and they're both painful, but the grief of someone with no hope is infinitely more regrettable than the grief of someone who says, it's okay, they're in my Father's hand and in the Son's hand, and no one can take them from that hand. They're secure, covered, carried by the great shepherd. We've got to take it with us. See, what we believe about Christ is not that he was unusually powerful, that he had incredible capacities, that he was a great teacher. We believe that he was God in the flesh, that he's the Lord of life, that he is the resurrection and the life. And by believing this, we believe and we know and we experience that we have life in his name.